So question number 2 tells us to observe the pairs of expressions that involve the product of two sums. As we can see here, the product of two sums or two differences, as we can see here. One thing I do want to point out, if you were confused in the last activity, is when we see x plus -5, this is the same thing as just x minus 5. X plus -1, it's the same thing as x minus 1. So whenever you have a plus and a minus sign, that negative is going to take over, and this is just subtraction. But coming back to what the question is asking us, it's saying when we have these products of two sums or two differences, how is each expression in factored form related to the equivalent expression in standard form? So what I've done here is I've taken two worked out responses from question number 1, and we're going to look at what this connection is. So here is my quadratic in factored form. And to show that it's equivalent to this quadratic in standard form, we've used the box method. Your final answer of a standard form is always written out in this number sentence with like terms combined. Even though the previous answer key does show the box worked out, it is very important that you are then taking the terms out of this box, adding them together, and getting your final standard form. So what is the connection here between this quadratic in factored form and this quadratic in standard form? One thing that we can look at are these terms here. So the constant terms here, when I add my two constants together, I get my coefficient of my x, of the plain x with no exponents, my b term. So that's interesting, right? It's a pattern that we're going to be using a lot. So again, when I add the constant terms from my factored form, so +2 plus +4, I get my b term. So I'm going to show us that 4 plus 2 gives us my coefficient, which means the number in front of my x, and this is my b term in standard form. And when I multiply my two constants, 4 times 2, I get my constant of the standard form. So that's the value without the x in the standard form, my c term. So 4 times 2 is 8. 4 plus 2 is 6. So this is an interesting pattern that we're actually going to be able to use to start factoring and to start very quickly being able to put functions from factored form into standard form without even having to use the box method. We're going to see how this connection applies to another one. So again, what we've just learned here is when we add our two factors together, our two constant factors together, the constant values that are in the parentheses next to the x, I get my b term. I get my coefficient in front of the x, and let's test it. -5 plus -1, so that's really like -5 minus 1 gets us to -6x. So -5 plus -1 does equal -6x. So that's the pattern we're seeing. Adding them gives us our b term. And then if we multiply the same two constants, we get our c term. -5 times -1, -5 times -1, does in fact give us +5. Because a negative times a negative is a positive. So that's the connection that we're going to be using throughout the rest of our lesson and throughout the rest of our unit, is again when we have the two constant terms from our factored form, so our two factors, when we add our two factors together, we get the b term of our standard form, the number in front of the x in our standard form. When we multiply the two values together, we get that constant value at the end of our standard form.